The program that I will be speaking about today I currently teach in Breton University in the Indigenous Studies program, Indigenous Studies department, and where I teach Mi'kmaq Studies and Political Science. The Indigenous Studies program, we have two streams in here. There's language and culture, and then we also have another stream, governance and history. So I teach in the governance and history, but I also teach a few culture courses too. And currently, I teach 5 courses per year, and we rotate these on a 5-year cycle, so we don't repeat each courses. So that when students come in here, they're able to take the full suite of courses over the 2 or 3 years. The age range of my students, actually, it kind of varies a little bit, but generally speaking, most of the students are just fresh out of high school. I teach in a particular program called Elmadec, and this is like a bridging program for students coming out of the Eskasoni High School and eases their transition into university. So I teach 2 courses there. I teach Introduction to Indigenous Studies and Introduction to Unloose Studies too. And all of the students there are approximately 17, 18, 19 years old. Now, in my other courses, generally speaking, the students are a little bit more older. They're in their early 20s. And I do have a number of students that may be over the age of 25. And from time to time, I will have uh, folks who are in their mid-career streams, or mature students as we like to call them. And sometimes we'll get the odd elder or two. What I find is that the students are coming in, and we teach them about all the other tribes. In the first course that they have to take, they have to learn about all the other tribes. And it's generally, we tend to follow what we call a a bit of a pyramid scheme. You know, not a pyramid scheme per se, but a pyramid approach to it. The bottom of it is that we have in Introduction to Indigenous Studies, we go wide but not too deep, in a way that we learn about Mi'kmaq people, Algonquin people, Haudenosaunee people, tribes in the United States, some tribes in Central America, South America, a little bit of a global approach. We talk about Australian Aborigines, New Zealand Maoris, and even tribes in Taiwan, and some tribes in Africa. So, and recently we've incorporated some Bedouin tribes in the Middle East, and we talk about how similar these effects are. But we don't get into it too deep because we don't have a whole lot of time, right? So it's broad. The next course that they have to take is Introduction to Unloose Studies, which is our tribe Ulnu, otherwise known as the Mi'kmaq people. Ulnu being people of the same tongue. So we get into a little bit more narrow focus, but a little bit more deeper. So we talk about the language, culture, history, spirituality of Ulnu people, and contact, and politics too. We also incorporate the political structure, the governance structure, and then the next level of courses at the 2 or 3 thousand level course is that we get a little bit more, even much more narrow, but much more deeper in scope and context. So, for example, I teach Mi'kmaq government, and I talk about traditional government before and after contact, shortly after contact, up until centralization. And well, yes, even after centralization, and during Confederation of Canada. And then the second part of that course is about contemporary Ulnu governance. What are the contemporary governance institutions that exist today? I talk about the Indian Act system of electing chiefs, what authority they have, what regulatory schemes, what lawmaking authority, and we get into self-government agreements or self-determination. I get into I look at some of the legislation that has been passed here, Mi'kmaq Education Act, and some of the tripartite agreements that we look at here. And then the last stage of the courses, at the top of the pyramid, we do, again, we get more narrow and much more deeper and much more focused in the course. So some of the courses there would be, just started to propose a new course on UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I do First Nation taxation and structuring of businesses in Canada. I do new contemporary issues, and I do other courses such as um, uh, the treaty, the Mi'kmaq treaties, and pre-contact and new Aboriginal rights and new treaty rights. And those are two courses that have split into two. It used to be Aboriginal treaty rights of the Unloose, but I look at the Aboriginal rights as being different and treaty rights as being different too. Yet here in Atlantic Canada, we have both Aboriginal rights and treaty rights that coexist here. And so as we start off with Introduction to Indigenous Studies, Unloose Studies, Mi'kmaq Government, and then Unloose Aboriginal Treaty Rights. So it's kind of a pyramid shape when we move up. And I think that's the success of the program is rooted in that, is that we move students along and move them up the pyramid until they graduate. So by the time they graduate, they don't need to go back and learn everything all over again in order to take a single course. As a professor, what I tend to use is the evaluations from the students. And so every course that we do here, we're evaluated by the students. And they have either they do it online or they do it in the classroom. We're finding that despite technology and everybody's being aware of technology, we find a much more high response rate comes from actually doing it in the classroom rather than online. You know. But we still make it available for folks to do it. And if the students are satisfied and comment free from these evaluations, it also that allows me to tweak the course, change it, or they'll say, they provide some constructive criticism, and they say, well, this part of the course was, well, boring. It's a phrase that I use or something like that, right? Or that they'll use, not me. Um, but they also say that the style and presentation and the discussion are, ranked excellent or good. So generally speaking, um, my evaluations have been very good in that. It could be the way I teach, it could be the content. I don't know. That's how I measure the success of the courses. Now, the overall program is measured by the institutions in different ways. One is that the number of students coming into the program, the number of students being retained, and the number of students successfully graduating. And I would also dare say, put it in that the number of students pursuing either professional studies or postgraduate or graduate studies. That's how I would measure the success of the program. So I would have like maybe 30 students in my class, introduction class, and my upper level courses will have about 15 in classes. And we graduated this year close to 46 students. So that tells me we're, in a way, you have to look at the success on that basis. So every year we graduate between 30 and 45 students. We do have a professional program in PED, and we do have one master's program. But generally speaking, the program we have here at CBU is really what I call a feeder university. We start them off here, and then we send them off to other universities to finish their either um, go on to professional schools or to graduate studies. That's generally speaking what we do here. The impact I generally see is I look forward each year to that aha moment. Um, when the students come in fresh from high school, they're all eager, they all learn particular way, but some of them also learn how to do root method. They basically are thinking about what is it that I'm looking for and how can they regurgitate that. And I try to put a stop to that. My overall goal in all of the classes is to have the students develop critical thinking skills. And some of the examples I use challenge them, and in return, they challenge me back on many things. Um, like, for example, in my treaty rights course, later on, I talk about our peace and friendship treaties. I bring out a draft of the treaties. I have all the students review the whole treaties. We talk about Treaty Day and what does this mean, the celebrations, and all of them have grown up with that concept. And then I say, well, what exactly do the treaties say? And how do we interpret them from an Unloose perspective? And how do these treaties get interpreted by the courts? And so one of the clauses that I use here is clause number 4 in the 1752 treaty. And I point out that our treaties are not just peace and friendship treaties, but they're also commerce treaties, they're trading treaties. And one of the things we can trade is, um, like I call them the couple F's: fish, fowl, um, and feathers, and also meat, you know, or anything. Basically, the treaty says that we can bring to Halifax or Sibukinagadi or any other place anywhere in the province anything that we wish to sell or trade. Now, most of the students, they're they're fine with that. They're okay. They said yes, we can go and sell everything. And then I challenged them. I said, well, what are our treaty obligations? We may have rights, but with rights come obligations. And so we talk about that concept. And one of the things I do is that I say, can we sell eagle feathers? And you can see almost immediately the reaction from the students is like, no, no, absolutely no. That those are sacred. Those are no stuff. And I'm like, but our treaties say we can sell feathers. They said, well, you can sell duck feathers, but not eagle feathers. I'm like, so I challenged them. I said, what makes the eagle more sacred than a duck or a hummingbird? And again, I said, this is what you need to think about, the critical thinking skills. And the other thing is that our obligation is to do conservation so that we may not benefit from this, but future generations or the 7 generations will. So it is up to us to create protections for the eagle so that we may not use or sell the feathers in our own generation because there's not enough eagles, but maybe the future generations will. The same goes with salmon. I said, why can't we sell salmon? They said, well, it's sold in stores everywhere, right? Or um, or the eel. Now the American eel is considered almost, well, it's went extinct in the Bay of Fundy, and so it's considered very endangered elsewhere. And eel is a very traditional food for us. And then now, as the meanwhile going to fisheries, we look at snow crab, and to close the recent issue of closing, and this is what we talk about in contemporary issues, the closing of the fisheries to protect the right whales. And they said, well, that's damaging to First Nations fisheries. And I'm like, but our treaty says we can, hunt and fish, even commercially. I said, we can hunt and fish whales. But since there's not enough whales, we need to ensure that protection and conservation of the whales exist for our generation so that our future generations may hunt or fish a whale in the future. We may not be able to, and that's the treaty obligations. And that's the goal and success in creating a new, what we call here, Biliwiyankidazulting, rethinking or thinking differently about a particular issue. The same goes with all lessons, like how we look at governance, how do we look at traditional, the governing structures here. Everything, my overall goal and how I measure success, if the students have critical thinking skills, then I have succeeded, and that this program has succeeded. Indigenous education is, for me here, is aligning it with Unloose, which is the only way of thinking, my way of thinking about a particular issue. And generally speaking, we have different worlds in which we all interact, and that's how our elders and our stories talk about these worlds. We have the earth world, the world beneath the earth, we have the water world, we have the world beneath the water, we have the sky world, we have the spirit world. And generally speaking, Indigenous education for me is helping folks move and interact with each world. Each world has their own rules and protocols and ceremonies, and each of them interact with each other. So we as Unmu people, we need to know how do we move from one world to another, and how do we interact and come back. And that's where the rules and protocols, how you behave in another life forces world, and that's indigenous education to me. Basically it's telling you how to behave in another world. So when you're entering, like for example, the water world, how you're supposed to behave, how to be respectful about, how do you treat animals, how do you treat the fishes, how do you treat the seaweed. um, when you're in going into the sky world, there's the wind, the breezes, everything. And also, where it's also a little bit more careful thought needs to go into, is where these worlds intersect, or where you move from one world to another, and even the micro worlds in there. And that's indigenous education for me. It's basically, we're telling folks how to move from one world to another, and how to survive and thrive. And each world has its own subworlds. For example, in my case, I use myself as an example. I grew up very traditional on the trap line, my mother's trap line in Maliguage. I couldn't hunt and fish. You know. So they said, you have to go to school, otherwise you'll starve. You know. So I went to school. I entered a world that very few people have come to, which is the legal world, the lawyer's world. And in that world, there's subworlds in there, the judiciary, the crown prosecutor, the legal aid, the civil law, partnerships, law firms, and nobody was able to tell me, how do you behave, how do you survive, how do you thrive in these worlds. As I moved from private practice to public practice to civil law to criminal law to family law, and how do you interact with the judges. This is a world that most almost don't know. And for me, the job of Indigenous education, our role is to prepare the next generation to be able to know. So I went there, I'm kind of the scout, I go back and I tell the others. And that's really what Indigenous education is all about. We prepare students to go into the next world, which is uh, professional studies or graduate studies, or even a PhD, or even to the working world. Um, there's high unemployment. We say this is what you have to do in order to get a job. You may need a trade, or you may need to think critical skill. How do you do policy analysis? How do you brief a chief and council? These are all things that Indigenous education needs to accomplish, and that's what we do here at CPU in our Indigenous Studies program. Get get an education in whatever form, fashion it is, um, because I believe that the more education you get, the more freedom you have. You know, and I'd like to see more students in the sciences. How to incorporate traditional knowledge, and even that phrase is not really accurate. How do you incorporate indigenous knowledge of the sciences into the Western sciences? How do you show students that we are people who have a huge math history, that we have a huge botany history, a biological history, we know all about chemistry. We did a research project not too long ago, last year, that showed that Indo people knew about antibiotics and antimicrobials long before Dr. Fleming discovered penicillin. We were already using it. We already knew about this. But stories that's taught in every single textbook is that Dr. Fleming accidentally discovered penicillin by accident. Well, if we had gone to the indigenous communities, we would have that knowledge was already there, but it wasn't valuable. It wasn't validated or wasn't seen as having any value. So, next 10 years, I like to see more students. Um, I like to see us take more control and responsibility for the entire educational system. And we can do that as part of self government and self determination. You know, we look at institutions of governance. We now know that in order for the Harvard project out of Arizona, University of Arizona, and University and Harvard University, they their initial findings show that three things are necessary to achieve successful economic development in Indian country, and that's sovereignty matters, cultural match, and institutions matter. So indigenous education needs, the rallying cry since the 1970s has been Indian control over Indian education. And I think we're still on that track, but we need to do it much more faster and better and clearer and for us. And by doing that, we're taking over governance over our own institution of education. When we do that, we also need to also teach about what are our responsibilities to education. That's where I would like to see us in 10 years. We need more human capacity, more indigenous peoples to start thinking about this. Here we'd be very successful in graduating folks. I don't see that, and the struggle still exists for many communities outside of Atlantic Canada. If you go to the West, we keep hearing the same statistics like out of Saskatchewan that it's more likely that a young Indigenous male under by the time he's 16 will go to jail instead of graduating, right? So those are the kind of things we need to make sure that everyone benefits, and everyone needs to go. Resource in terms of money, but don't get me wrong, money helps. Money does help, and stuff like. But the commitment and the action as part of decolonizing, we, there's an indigenous academic from Hawaii who wrote in one of a collection of papers that was submitted there. I was reading a long time ago, and I remember the lessons I were learned. He said the decolonizing involves a number of steps. One is that we need to remember what happened, and then we need to mourn what happened, and then we need to dream. What's the future? But once we have the dream, we also need to take the commitment, take the next step, and take action to make that happen. So I would like to see institutions as part of their decolonizing approaches. We know what has happened. We mourn, and we're in constant, part of it. We can dream about indigenous education for the future, but we need those institutions. Their primary resource that we need is to help us, and they need to commit to ensuring that the dream is achieved, and we need to take action. That's the resourcing that I would like to see.